So for this week's painting, I am going to be attempting to paint this miniature landscape that you can see. Well, this isn't a miniature landscape, this is a real life full-size landscape, but I'm going to be painting it miniature. It's going to be a bit of a study while I try and practice my landscape skills, because I love watercolour landscapes and I really want to be able to paint them successfully. So this is a bit of a practice for me. So instead of doing this as a tutorial, it's going to be more of a walkthrough while I work my way through this landscape and talk you through the process. So there's probably going to be a bit more dialogue in this, so feel free to mute it if you just want to see the landscape develop. But for anyone else who is interested in listening, I am going to talk you through what I'm doing along the way and then do a little bit of a review at the end where I will see what I liked about this landscape and what I think I might change if I were to do a bigger painting based on this study. So I started out with a really simple pencil sketch on this tiny piece of paper. There's not very many reasons I am doing this in miniature. It could be done a bigger size. I just happen to have this scrap of paper that I wanted to use. And I feel like it's a little less intimidating practicing on a smaller piece of paper. You don't have as much areas to fill, and I can do this as a study with the intention that I could eventually create a larger painting from this. So I have sketched it out and I'm mixing up my colours. My plan for this is to try and use 3 colours, so French Ultramarine, Alizarin Crimson and Yellow Ochre, to try and reduce the palette down a little bit, not add too many bright colours. Again, because it's a small size, I don't want to overpower it by having a lot of different colours in there, but I also want to try and tie this painting in together. So I'm going to start out with the sky. I'm going to do the sky wet in wet and just take some clean water and drag it all the way down to the horizon line and then start adding in my paint. So I'm pre-mixing my colours for this as well, so I can just drop them straight into this wet wash without having to stop and mix up colours all the time. I'm starting out with French Ultramarine mixed with a tiny little bit of crimson just to knock back that blue a little bit, and I'm going to drag that most of the way down the page, and then before I reach the horizon line I'm going to switch to some yellow ochre and then some yellow ochre mixed in with crimson for a more orange hue right across the bottom. And I'm working the sky through the trees so that there is some sky colour behind the trees when I eventually put those in. And then I'm using my brush at the end just to clean up that edge a little bit to stop the paint from dropping down into the field area. So I've left that to dry, and now I'm going to put in a bit of a wash across the foreground to indicate the field. Now yellow ochre is going to be the main base for this, and I'm mixing in some French Ultramarine to give it a bit of a green hue. I'm mixing in some crimson when I want it to have a bit of a pink tinge to it. And all I'm trying to do here is recreate that feeling when I was there looking at that sunset. Now, although you can't see the sunset in this particular photo, the sunset was happening on the left, you could still see a little bit of pink in the field and a little bit of those red colours from the sunset. So I'm trying to include a little bit of that in the foreground here as well. Towards the foreground, I'm going to use the brush to kind of drag the paint across the front in a dry brush technique, just to get a bit of texture right in the foreground so it looks like it's a bit closer than the fields further back. I'm also going to add more of a green tint to my mix, So a bit more French Ultramarine in with that yellow ochre for a little bit of green in the bottom right hand corner there. I did end up using some Sap Green to mix in as well, just so that it did look green rather than a darker grey colour. While that wash is beginning to dry, I'm using a mixture of French Ultramarine and Crimson, so it's more of a muted purple tone, just to add a couple of shadow details into the field, which hopefully will blend out if that wash is still wet enough. So while this was almost dry, I started adding in some of the tree details to the background. I made a really dark green with French Ultramarine and some yellow ochre, and then I made a shadow colour with a bit more Crimson and French Ultramarine just to put in some of the darker details of these trees. And I'm painting them in a line across the back. I'm using a really small brush for this just because this painting is minuscule, but if I was doing this regular size I wouldn't have to use such a tiny brush for this because it doesn't need to be detailed. I'm just trying to make really random shapes along the background, and when I add that darker shadow colour I'm just dropping it in here and there and seeing where it goes, but I'm not putting it anywhere in particular, and I'm not paying that much attention to the reference photo here. I'm just trying to make little tree shapes. Once I've finished them on the right hand side, I'm going to do a smaller line of hedgerow on the left with the exact same technique. I'm using some yellow ochre slightly toned down with French Ultramarine just to drag out a little bit of texture along the foreground there, so it seems like it's a little bit closer. And with that same yellow ochre colour, I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow underneath the part here where the telegraph pole is going to be, just to act as a bit of shadow and a little bit of a scrubby area under there, which is a bit darker than the surroundings. I'm trying not to make it too noticeable because I want it to be subtle, as if it's fading into the background. I'm also going to use that same tone for some of the hay bales, which I used across all of the hay bales. I did darken some of them up eventually, but I just began to indicate the shape without trying to put too much detail in, just indicating that there's some hay in that field. I'm continuing to add a few shadow tones around the hay bales and just drag a little bit of that across the ground as well, just to try and connect those into the landscape a little bit. For the hay bale in the front, I decided to use the same dry brush technique of just dragging yellow ochre across that hay bale so you could see a little bit of texture and it looks like there's hay in there instead of it being one flat colour. I'm adding in some more crimson and ultramarine blue on the right just for the shadow side, and adding some darker tones along the bottom as well where it's going to connect in with the landscape. Just dragging some of that colour out and trying to make it look more realistic, but I'm just really practicing different techniques here and figuring out what works so I know what to use in future landscapes. I decided to add in more detail to the grass in the foreground, so I've darkened that up a little bit with a darker mix of yellow ochre and French ultramarine. I think there's a bit of sap green in there as well just to get that green tone to it. I'm not drawing every single blade of grass. I'm using that dry brush technique to begin with and then just putting in a few blades of grass here and there in between. I quite like adding paint splatter to my paintings, so I'm practicing that again. I have remembered to use a paper towel to cover up the rest of it this time because usually I make a bit of a mess of this, and I'm just flicking the brush out to add in a little bit of darker yellow ochre along the front, just disappearing off into the edge so it's not a flat line all the way across. So I'm using my fine detail brush to put in some fine detail in the grass in the foreground just to drag out a few extra strands. I'm also going to use my crimson mixed with a tiny bit of French ultramarine to add in some teeny tiny little pink flowers. So I'm adding in some knapweed into the foreground as well. It's so small, I don't know if you'll be able to see it properly, but I am adding in some tiny little pink flowers just to add a touch of colour to that bottom corner. So for the telegraph pole, I have mixed up all of my three main colours to make a bit of a brown colour, and I'm drawing that out as carefully as I can. I'm just doing little movements here. It doesn't need to be a super straight line because it's in the distance. It can be a little bit hazy, that's fine. When it comes to adding in the wires for this, I'm diluting that brown mixture and I'm trying to do it in one really quick motion so that it seems really, really subtle, and I'm pretty happy with that tiny little wire that comes off of it. So these wires look really quite thin and faint, and it's a little bit difficult to see them here. You can see them better on the actual painting in real life, but I don't mind that they're kind of faded into the distance because that is the intention. I decided not to add in the wires that come all the way across. I think it works fine just in that little corner, and I don't want to drag it over and risk ruining it because the line is so thin on this tiny painting that it would be very, very easy to overdo it and have a big mark right the way across the painting. So I'm going to leave that out. And what I'm doing now is I'm adding in some more shadow tones. Because I put in the darker colour for the telegraph pole, it made everything else seem fairly light. So I'm going over again some of these areas with a darker shadow tone just so that it ties in a little bit better with the scene. I added in a little more shadow detail on the hay bale, and now I am adding in some more splatter because why not? This is one of my favourite parts, so I usually overdo it, but I am being careful to cover up the rest of the scene so that I don't end up with random paint splatters in the sky. And now I'm putting in a bit more texture in the foreground just so that it looks like it's a little bit closer to you, and then the rest of the field seems like it's more distant because it's so subtle in comparison. So at this point I decided to try and blend out some of the detail on the left so that the main focal point was around that hay bale. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to blend that out into the background a little. So at this point, I thought I was pretty much finished, and I've removed the masking tape from the edges. I think it is quite a cute little painting here, and to say that this is just a miniature study, I think it's not too bad, but I am going to come back and make some changes to this in a moment, so I'll go over those in a second. So this was the part I was really pleased with myself because I actually remembered to film me making some adjustments. Usually I always skip this part and then have to update at the end, but this time I am trying to amend this a little bit, and what I've decided to do is go over the foreground with some yellow ochre because it's just very light in comparison to the sky. That French ultramarine is really strong in the sky, and the foreground just looks a little bit light. And to say this is supposed to be sunset and it's supposed to be getting darker, it just wasn't the right tone for me. So I'm mixing yellow ochre with the tiniest amount of blue and crimson just to tone it down a little bit, and then I am adding a wash all the way across that foreground, so over all the hay bales and every part of it, just covering everything and turning it down just a little bit and darkening up that foreground. I waited for the wash to dry just a little and then added in a few darker tones as well to that foreground, and I've also darkened up a few areas of the hay bale as well so that it still looks like it's dark in comparison to the now darker field behind it. So once this had dried further, I decided to darken those shadows up again. I'm really on finishing touches now, and I'm putting more detail into the foreground just so that it looks like it's a bit closer. Doing that wash all the way over has kind of blended out some of those details, so I'm dragging out my shadow colour along the field edge, and I really like the way that looks, and I'm glad I decided to do a little bit more behind the hay bale as well and just really add some texture into that foreground. So that kind of brings us to the end of this painting, and I did say I was going to do a bit of a review at the end, which I'm going to try and keep short because I feel like I've spoken a lot in this YouTube video already. But if this is something that you're interested in or a format that you like, leave a comment below and I'll try and include more reviews at the end of other paintings. So really quickly, things I might change. The sky here is a little bit dark in the top right hand corner. It's not a major thing, but because this painting is so small, I think it's a little bit more noticeable, so maybe that could be a bit more blended out in future. The tree line at the back, the difference between the darker areas of the tree and the lighter areas of the tree are quite noticeable, and I think I'd try and blend those together a little more just to push those distant trees into the background so they don't look too obvious. and as if they're coming too far forward. The horizon line kind of migrated upwards a little bit on the right, so I would try and bring that back down again. Again, it's not really that much of a big deal. There is a tiny white gap behind the hedgerow on the left, which is the pickiest thing I can find, but it does indicate an area that I might want to focus on if I were to paint this again. It shows an area that could have been missed, so I would just try and maybe mix the sky gradient and the land wash together, so that you didn't have any white areas in the background and you wouldn't get that. And a lot of the other issues, I feel like they were resolved with the yellow ochre wash at the end, so that kind of solved a lot of the problems for me. The landscape did look a bit disjointed, the hay bales in the background didn't really seem to fit in so well, and it was very light in comparison to the sky. So just doing that wash over the top I think has made a big difference, so I think that resolved a lot of the issues I had with this painting. The composition, maybe I would change that if I were to do that again, maybe make more of the hay bale as the focal point and just move it a little more centre, not right in the middle because I think that would look weird, but it could move a little bit more into the centre. So moving on to the things that I liked about this, I'm really happy with the wash that I used. Usually this is an area where I struggle a little bit, and I usually end up with some cauliflowers or some backgrounds in the watercolour, and this time it was much more controlled and considered, and I had my paints mixed up before I started it, and I'm really happy with how smooth it looks, and I'll definitely try and do that in the future. Another thing that I'm happy with is the fact that I used just 3 main colours for this. So I did use a bit of Sap Green. I think there might have been a touch of burnt sienna in the hay bale as well. But for the majority of this painting I used 3 colours, and I really like how that's tied the landscape together and made everything fit together quite nicely. So that's something I think I'll try and do again in future landscapes. I quite like the addition of the knapweed in the bottom corner, and the little telegraph pole too. It's just tiny little details that I think tie this painting together nicely, and it's not something that's immediately noticeable or obvious, but if you spent a little while looking at the painting, then you're drawn into those areas and you can see tiny little details, and I really like that, so that's something that I'll look into in the future. I like the foreground effects, the dry brush techniques, and love the splatter effects, but I always love splatter effects in my paintings. So I'm really happy with those and how they made the foreground look, and it was achieved with pretty minimal effort, so I am pretty happy with that. But to be honest, the biggest thing that I like about this painting, and perhaps one of the reasons that I am so attached to this tiny little landscape, is the fact that this painting came from a memory of mine. It came from me being in that scene and seeing that sunset and viewing that field for myself. And I was there, you know, I saw those hay bales, I saw the pinks in the field, I saw the knapweed, even though it's not in the photo. I saw that textured foreground as I walked through it. And I really like having created a painting from a place that I actually visited. And I think that's probably the biggest positive out of this, and something that I'd really like to carry on doing with future landscapes. I really like the fact that I was able to incorporate some of my own memories into this, and I just feel a bit more of a connection to the scene now because of that. So that's probably my biggest takeaway from this. So with that being said, I think it's about time to wrap this video up this week because I have talked a lot through this. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for bearing with me. I know it's been a little bit of a different format this time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been enjoyable. Or I hope you've learned something. I mean, maybe I'm the only one who learned something, but that's okay. Thank you for watching. I will be back next Wednesday with another tutorial.